So, my name is Pat Bowen, and I'm here to introduce you to our endorsement committee. And I'm going to explain the process to you, what we've done so far and where we're going. So, I'm a CCI Action member from Iowa City, by the way. And so, as you might know, we are a statewide people power group with members in all 99 counties. And CCI Action has members of all ages and all races and backgrounds. Our goal is to take on corporate power in all of its forms. Among other things, we fight for clean water, climate justice, racial justice, living wages, and health care for all. To make real change in everyday people's lives on these issues, we know that we have to change business as usual politics. We want access to our governor, we want a seat at the table, and we want you to come to us for advice. We are a powerhouse organization. We've been around over 40 years. We must do politics differently to make life more just and small d democratic for all people. To that end, we have formed this committee to decide if there is a like-minded candidate who we should endorse. So our endorsement process has three main parts. First, we ask candidates like yourself to fill out our issue questionnaire. Now we have invited selected candidates in for screening meetings like this one. And thirdly, we will survey our members to find out what issues they care about and what candidates they prefer. Once we have completed all three parts of the process, this committee will make an endorsement decision. Should the committee and CCI Action Board decide to endorse, this is more than just an endorsement on paper. We will put feet in the street and we will knock on doors to get out the vote. And after the election, we will make sure our candidates govern as they campaigned. So we have 5 prepared questions, and we will ask the question we would like to have you answer in 3 minutes or less. And then following those 5 questions, if time permits, we have about 5 or 6 additional questions from the other members. And so we'll get into the screening at this point, and the first question is mine. And so in 3 minutes or less, who are you and why are you running for governor?
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation, and it sounds like I at least made a cut to get here, so that's very nice to hear too. I'm Nate Boulton. I'm the state senator who represents East Des Moines and Pleasant Hill. I'm in my first term in the Iowa Senate, and it's a very different environment than what I expected when I was campaigning. Of course, Democrats had the majority in the Iowa Senate as I was campaigning. When I arrived, we had a very different environment. We had Republicans with full control of the Iowa House, Iowa Senate, and Governor Branstad, Lieutenant Governor Reynolds pushing a legislative agenda from the governor's office. My hope was to stand up to that agenda, and I'm very proud of the work that I did along with my House and Senate colleagues to show that we were ready to stand up to that agenda, to show that there is a better and different vision forward for our state. And I think this election is going to be a critical opportunity for us to share that vision forward for our future in this state that should look very different from what we have seen, not just this past year, but really the last 7 years in state government. When they came after workplace rights, I was there front and center as the ranking Democrat on the Labor Committee, pushing against those awful issues that they pushed through, whether it was public sector bargaining rights, when they tried to gut our workers' compensation system, when they pushed through a preemption bill that actually reached out to lower the minimum wage in 5 Iowa counties that took action on behalf of their lower wages, the lowest wage earners in their communities. So that is why I am in this race for governor, is because not only do I want to see us resist the awful agenda that we saw this past year, but actually start pushing through that vision forward for our state. Getting away from corporate coupon economics, trying to fund low-wage, low-skill jobs in our state at the expense of a quality education system that produces the next skilled workforce for the next generation of Iowa's economy. Those are the things that I think we can talk to Iowans about directly and hopefully push through a very different vision forward for the long-term future of our state.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Shereen Ortiz. fellow East Sider.
Yeah.
Retired school teacher. My question is, what values motivate you, and what is the core message of your campaign?
So I talk a lot on the campaign about my upbringing in Columbus Junction. I grew up in a union household. My dad was a union worker in a tire plant in Muscatine. His dad, my grandfather, spent 2 decades as chief union steward in a packing house in Columbus Junction, a wrath packing house. When I talk about my approach to economic achievement in Iowa and success in Iowa, it's an economy that works for people like my parents and grandparents, that allows people to earn a wage that can support their family with adequate benefits and be able to pass on to the next generation the opportunity to succeed. We've gotten away from that in this state, and I think that's got to be the most pressing concern, is that the Branstad and now Reynolds agenda has been trying to actually attract bad acting employers who want to come to our state only if we weaken our workers' compensation system, only if we have low minimum wage laws, only if we have gutted public sector bargaining, and we start seeing that, what kind of state are we going to become for the next 20 years? And what kind of jobs are we attracting? We are devaluing the greatest asset we have. Our economy is strong because of our people. Having the most educated, skilled, productive workforce has been the hallmark of economic success in Iowa. It's not been corporate coupons and an agenda that has brought in low-wage, low-skill jobs for the short term. So that's what has steered me in this campaign, as well as what I've done for my life. I'm a workers' rights attorney. I went to Simpson College and then Drake Law School, and I have been practicing workers' rights law for the last 12 years, fighting for the rights of individuals in the workplace, making sure that people are not just cast aside when they are injured, but actually they are given the opportunity to get quality medical care and fair compensation so they can transition from a devastating work injury to the next phase of their life. So those are the things that drive me, both in my personal career as well as in public service.
In terms of other maybe core values, I'm just curious about sort of your perspective on the whole issue of money in politics, how everyday people feel like it just hijacks the whole system out from underneath. So how do you feel about having money in politics?
Yeah, it's very concerning at this point, especially where our Iowa system is right now. It's an embarrassing situation right now. We are so far behind even the federal government in bringing sunshine into our political system. I mean, right now we have candidates for governor out there raising money, and we have no idea where the money is coming from, how much they have, and we won't until after the first of the year. There will be a whole year of fundraising with no sunlight on it. I think we need to take a step to make sure at least we can see what is happening with fundraising earlier in the process. So having regular quarterly filings. I think the federal system that at least caps the amount individuals and political action committees can contribute is necessary in our system. Again, it's limitless contributions. So you could have one of the Koch brothers get involved in 6 or 7 key districts in Iowa House and Iowa Senate with their level of resources, and potentially single-handedly determine who controls the Iowa House and the Iowa Senate. 2 parts of our government with fairly limited contributions from them that would tilt the balance in a competitive race. I also think we ought to have a constitutional amendment on Citizens United. I think that's been a very, very disappointing thing. And as an attorney somebody who looks at constitutional law, I disagree with the Supreme Court's conclusion in the first place, but we can address that with a constitutional amendment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, hello.
Hi.
Thanks for coming. My name is Nick Shute from Hardin County.
Yes.
Family farmers are being driven out of business and small towns are dying. What is your vision for rural Iowa?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks for mentioning rural communities as well as family farming, because the two go hand in hand. My mom and stepdad still live on a heritage farm. It's been in my stepfather's family for over 150 years in Columbus Junction. We have a great network of people across this state that have been family farmers for generation after generation, that are very committed to seeing sustainable agricultural practices in this state, who are committed to seeing their small towns succeed and expand for the next generation of farming in their local community, who are worried about topsoil runoff, who are worried about conservation practices, the quality of life in rural Iowa that comes with hunting and fishing opportunities in land management as well as water quality management. So I think there is a great partnership that we can have, and I think we do a huge disservice when we say this is an urban versus rural issue, because people in rural Iowa have every concern about safe drinking water, about being able to enjoy natural resources in our state, that, you know, whether you're in urban or rural Iowa, you have the same concerns in that matter. My wife is the statewide director for trails for a conservation nonprofit. Think about the tourism opportunity that comes with being able to have pride again in our natural resources in this state. We've got a great network of trails. She does a great job, and I'm proud of her. But I will say, we can't really use that as a tourism opportunity. If people come to Iowa and they go hiking, or they go down one of our water trails, or they go on a bike trail and see those beach closed signs that we see every year that have become normal to us, and that cannot be part of our way of life in Iowa, to expect to have to check with the newspaper to see if it's safe to go swimming at a public beach. And I think that frustration is very real across the state. So I think that's something that there are partnerships to be made with those long-term farming families that don't want to see their way of life deteriorate further.
Okay, so we're talking rural here. What is your plan for fair prices and open markets for the family farmer?
So I think there also needs to be some attention from the federal government on this as well. I think that there's a certain level of being economically pushed into farming practices that are less sustainable and less market driven. Where we've seen the federal farm bill in recent years. I don't have a lot of confidence that, you know, Trump and Purdue are going to produce a very different vision for Iowa agriculture in the near future. But where I grew up in southeast Iowa, we have seen successes in produce farming, for example. You know, you have, you know, Muscatine, Conesville, that area with watermelon, cantaloupe farming with a lot more produce. We've seen enhanced opportunities to market directly through farmers markets in this state, and we can do some things at the state level to further support that. Not only does that help local farmers sell their products, but also it helps with just nutrition in our communities as well. Our prisons do a better job of this than our communities. I've toured our prisons in Mitchellville and in Clarinda. They do a decent job of actually producing food on site that they use for inmates at those facilities. We don't do a very good job of that in our local communities, giving that option and opportunity. So those are some things that I think we can do at the state level.
All right, thank you.
And I would also mention investing in rural Iowa infrastructure. You know, not investing in singular plants. You know, one of the examples is the investment of $100 million in a single fertilizer plant in southeast Iowa. Think of what that $100 million could do, partnering with local governments on funds to address infrastructure needs, so you can support the economy long term in your community. So you're addressing, you know, water supply lines and other things that community will need to continue to be successful. Excuse me.
Okay. Hi Nate, my name is Eli Shepard and I'm a lifelong resident of Iowa City. I was reading through your questionnaire, and in your questionnaire response, you began around the minimum wage question around 5 for 15. You began by framing your plan to incrementally raise wages in terms of developing a strong workforce to be competitive with neighboring states and keeping up with the growing economy. Both frameworks in which the lives and urgent needs of everyday people are sidelined with the amorphous demands of the economy. $15 an hour is the bare minimum wage human beings in Iowa can survive on. Why do you believe that workers in Iowa should wait 7 years until 2024 just to be paid a baseline livable wage?
Well, I've supported a $15 minimum wage. I ran on achieving a $15 minimum wage when I ran for the state senate. I tried to do what I could as a state senator to at least get the Republicans to adopt a minimum wage that would have prevented actually telling people in communities that they had to see their paychecks reduced this last year with a preemption bill that gave no account to those communities in Wapello County and Johnson County and here in Polk County, where people will be earning $2 and $3 less for the in the lifespan of those minimum wage bills, simply because Republicans would not shelter those people. We're behind 5 of our 6 neighboring states in minimum wage, and I think we have to have a plan to get to $15. The reality is Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the governor's office right now. We couldn't even get them to pay attention to the opportunity to preserve the minimum wage in the 5 counties that did stand up for lowest wage earners. Hopefully, we'll have a different House, different Senate when we get there in Terrace Hill next year. But at the same time, we have to have a plan that addresses the needs of workers now and still gets us to the point where we can stop these ongoing, endless debates of a need to double the minimum wage or increase it by 1/3 every 5 to 10 years. Get to the point where we can get to a living minimum wage and index it to inflation to start making that difference. But right now, the political environment in Iowa, I couldn't even get a subcommittee hearing on the proposal that would have protected Iowa workers from having the minimum wage cut in their communities. That's how bad it is.
Nate, I'd like to follow up with that. You speak about your attempt to get the attention of the legislators. I would suggest to you that what you need to do is be working to get the attention of our neighborhoods and our communities and towns. That's where the power is. If you look to the legislature, that isn't where the power is. The fact of the matter is that I think that we started in Polk County negotiating from a very weak position. And when we met with you here in headquarters, you were pretty comfortable with, Tommy Hawkins Smith's kind of idea, and it was kind of a graduated 3-year thing. I think it was 825, 925, 1010. Again, a jobs report doesn't mean anything to me when the jobs don't pay. And so we have an epidemic of the working poor. And in Des Moines Public Schools, 74% of our kids qualify for free and reduced lunches. So, I guess my question is, you've been through an experience with minimum wage. This new proposal really looks like you're negotiating really from a position of weakness, because what people want is bold leadership. And we saw an example of that this summer during our state convention. We've seen an example of that with our membership in this organization. We've gone from 3,000 to 4,000 members. People want bold leadership. You need to get out there and say it. I'm going to stand for $15 an hour today, and I'm not going to backslide on this. Otherwise, we just continue to sort of debate this issue from a very weak position. My challenge to you is to do that. And my question is, what have you learned after going through that process? Are you really confident that this kind of a graduated, taking forever minimum wage is going to resonate with people?
I think it has. I think we've had a very positive response to it. And I think, the reality is we have a legislative process that it has to be worked through. It does. And I think that we have a lot of potential to have people gravitate to a real solution that gets through this legislative process that can actually start impacting lives right away. If we're in a position where we will not raise the minimum wage unless it gets to $15 an hour, I think there are a lot of families that suffer in the interim. And that to me, I have a hard time with.
I don't think anybody's saying that we don't raise the minimum wage if we can't get to 15. What we're saying is that you can't compromise from a position of not even having to begin to fight by just saying that our hands are tied and that this is where we're going. So I'm still wondering why we have to gradually increase it over this long period of time when we're leading with the concerns of the economy or the legislature and not the concerns of people that you're saying.
I disagree with that. I think that's a mischaracterization of what I said. What I'm talking about is actually getting a bill passed through the legislature. I'm not saying I'm prioritizing the legislature over people, and I think that is a misstatement.
Okay.
I wanted to address issues around healthcare. What action would you take here in Iowa to make up for the lack of federal action on healthcare?
Yeah, it's been very frustrating for me. I serve on the Hawkeye board here in Iowa, the Healthy and Well Kids in Iowa board that's there for children's health insurance for families at a need level that qualify for that program. If nothing happens with the federal health insurance debate, and all we see is the Trump budget, we will see 20% of our resources diminished right out of the gate for our ability to provide health insurance to children in Iowa through that organization. So there are very real threats right now, regardless of what happens with, whatever the next flavor of repeal and replace is, or skinny repeal, or no repeal and still replace, or whatever the next.
What action will you take?
Yeah, no, I'm getting there. We're walking through it. So that's the first thing. It's very, very concerning that right now, our federal level, there hasn't been a very good partnership there. At our state level, one of the most specific actions that I've called on is getting us out of the privatized system for Medicaid that has been a failure from the start. It was based on inadequate financial information that was used by the managed care organizations that they relied on, that resulted in them making a huge miscalculation on the cost of what their services would have to be. That has said, that they've told us now that unless they get a bailout, they may not be able to stay in the system. Providers are telling us that they are seeing so many delays and reimbursements and denials that it's going to have an impact on the services they can provide at hospitals and clinics in Iowa. And that doesn't just affect Medicaid recipients, that affects everyone across the board. The hospital is starting to scale back the services they provide. And the patients are telling us that they're having a very difficult time navigating the system and getting their authorizations in time. I spoke with a pediatrician who talked about how she wrote a prescription. The prescription was not filled due to delays with the privatized Medicaid system. That child had to go to the emergency room to get the care that they needed to address the non-filled prescription. And then, of course, the filling of the prescription was the expense on top of that. So the delays are even starting to cause bigger and bigger problems. In terms of mental health, I've introduced legislation that would have reopened 2 of our state's 4 mental health facilities that the government closed. And just completely ironically said we need to modernize the system, close these facilities, and did nothing to replace the bed space that was lost in those facilities. I introduced legislation that would have forced reopening those 2 facilities. I actually stood up as an attorney against that and challenged that action in court. So those are some things I think we have to do immediately. In terms of reproductive health care, we saw a bill that went through that pulled federal funding as well as state funding for Planned Parenthood clinics in Iowa, based on an ideological difference. And several senators said over and over again this new network was going to replace those services. Well, 4 Planned Parenthood clinics have closed, but there's been no new network spring up or reopen. So I would reverse that decision, be back to funding reproductive health care, particularly in rural Iowa. Where I grew up in southeast Iowa, 3 clinics were closed that served southeastern Iowa. The need for those services doesn't go away. The need for mental health services doesn't go away simply because you close facilities. Because the need still exists. So those are things that we can do at the state level. Then I've called on Governor Reynolds to get on the phone with her campaign chairs, her campaign chairs, Senator Grassley, Senator Ernst, and start talking with them about representing Iowa's interests in terms of the federal health care system. So we need to get more people access and coverage. And if we can get to a point where we can get universal health care through the federal government, we need to be advocating for that. Because we have too many Iowans in need right now. So those are some things that I would see that we need to do immediately right now in Iowa.
I noticed that in any of your response, you didn't even mention the idea of universal or single-payer health care. And I didn't hear that.
I did.
You did? Okay. I'm sorry.
Yes, I did.
Well, please address what you consider to be universal and single-payer. What is the difference between them and how do you support it?
So the point that I made in my response was I think it takes a federal government partnership to do it. Based on the size of our state, I think having an Iowa universal health care system is probably not going to be something that is something we can do at the state level. But I think we do need to press members of Congress and our senators to get us to a point where we have universal access to health care in this country. Mostly out of a sense of morality, but also out of a sense of economics, right? I think that has been a drain on economic success in Iowa. businesses dealing with healthcare costs that have been unpredictable, workers who have been able to secure access to healthcare through health insurance that's affordable. I think we need a game changer there, but I think to me, it has to be done at the federal level.
Thank you. We have to move on to Ken.
If elected, are you willing to co-govern with CCI Action and other people power groups?
So, define co-govern. What do you mean?
Well, by co-governing, we mean that, and I'll use CCI Action as my foundation. We want a meaningful seat at the table. We want to have access to you. We call, you answer the phone. We also want you to come to us and ask for advice, because we've been doing this for a long time, and we know what the issues are, and we have solutions that people would listen. We have things we can offer. And so by co-governing, we want to be there, present. We want you to ask us questions, and we want you to listen to our advice. That's what we mean by co-governing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a basic in governing, is to engage constituents and groups to be part of the discussion. You know, I was very frustrated to see what happened, for example, with IPERS funding. You know, the lieutenant governor is calling for an IPERS task force, and then you have Charles Snyder pushing for, you know, IPERS reform. And what do we get? It's nothing about the stakeholders or recipients having a seat at the table in discussion. It's an outside group with what seems like a foregone conclusion on what they're going to do with the program, excluding the stakeholders, excluding Iowa citizens, and farming it off. So I think as a senator, I've been very approachable and engaging with your group. When you've been to the state capitol, I've come down to visit with you. When Cherie and others were talking about, you know, the minimum wage in Polk County, I engaged in the discussion and came to the table on that to see where my role would be in that. So no, I think it is important that we continue to have discussions and continue to have involvement. And I would hope you continue to engage me as well.
So if I understood you correctly, then when we come up to the State House and ask you to come out to lobby with us, you're more than willing to come and lobby with us. But what I did not hear is that you came to us first. You didn't come to us and ask, hey, this is a policy that's come before the Senate. What's your input on that? You made your decisions based on, well, did not include our input until we came to you and said, here's how we feel about it. So is that going to change if you become governor? Are you going to come to us and ask? Because we are experts in certain areas. We're strong on clean water and fight for 15 and so on. Did you come to us? Will you come to us on these issues, or are you just paying a lip service by saying you want to co-govern with us?
No, I mean, again, paying lip service, I think, is an unfair characterization. I'm not having a discussion as well, but you know, I think I've tried to be as engaging as possible, and I'll continue to try and do more and more. I really will. Thank you.
Sherry.
Sherry Hawk from Ankeny.
Sherry.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if you believe that you have a realistic chance of winning this nomination, and assuming you do, what is your plan to win?
Okay. I do. I wouldn't have got in the race if I didn't think I had a chance to win. And we've been campaigning very aggressively. You can even probably hear it a little bit in my voice. It's a little strained, but we've covered over 40 counties already. And we're going to continue to engage people at every level that we can to build the campaign we need. One of the things I talk about in my stump speeches is I think the 2018 election is truly a fight for the soul of our state. If what we saw in this last legislative session is ratified with a Republican governor and Republicans in control of the House and Senate, we will have long-term problems in this state as a result. So my plan and approach has been to engage Iowans at the individual level and we'll continue to do campaign stops every chance we get in rural Iowa and mid-sized communities and in large communities. We're putting together the team that we need to get there. I'm proud to be supported by 17 of my House and Senate colleagues who believe that we can get it done and that we will be able to win that fight in 2018. So we're putting together the coalition that we need to get out in the communities and get the support that we will need to win this race. So I feel good about it. We even are leading in the corn poll at the state fair. So I mean, you know, be proud of that. Yeah, yeah.
I have any pictures of you eating a corn dog.
I do get, speaking of pictures, I get, anytime I have a family member or a friend at the state fair, I get a picture of the jar. They're so excited to put the little corn kernel in. That is an Iowa tradition right there. So no, I in all seriousness though, I feel like we are building momentum in this campaign. We see a great response. It's not that we've just visited the 40 counties, but when we visit places from Orange City, where we had, you know, activists showing up in a county that voted 85% for Steve King. We've had people showing up in mid-sized towns, which are going to be critical for Democrats to win. You know, in Marshalltown and Fort Dodge, we had 40 or 50 people there at those stops. I don't want to be like Donald Trump and talk about crowd size all the time, but people are excited about what is happening. And what's been critical about this campaign for me is to take that dark frustration from this 2017 legislative session and the frustrating results in 2016 and start seeing that positive vision forward and movement forward out of this and getting people motivated to do something about it, not just, you know, to resist an agenda, but actually start fighting for something. Start fighting for adequately funding our schools, start fighting for quality job growth and responsible budgeting practices that gets it away from the coupon economics and keeps our economy growing to its strength. You know, Cherie's right. When we have too many low wage earners in this state, at a time when we have low unemployment and revenues are up 1.3% from last year, there is no excuse for the state to be using rainy day emergency funds to make ends meet in state government. There's no excuse for mid-year budget cuts followed by fiscal year 17 budget cuts, followed by what very likely will be another round of mid-year budget cuts when we go back to the legislature in January. We'll probably have a special session just to approve using more of the state's credit card to keep the lights on in state government. That cannot happen when we are at an economically stable time in Iowa. And it's because we have too many people earning too few wages in this state. And we have too many corporate giveaways right now blowing a hole in our state budget. Those two things are the reason why we have this manufactured budget crisis. There's no excuse for it otherwise.
Just as a follow-up, you mentioned the 85% Republican in Orange City. I was wondering if your tactics are different in, for example, Steve King districts or areas. Are there different things that you have to focus on in your process?
No, I think our message has been, you know, pretty well received, whether you're in a small town, mid-sized town, or larger community. I don't think the message changes as we go around. You know, like I said, we have this kind of assumed urban versus rural divide that's out there. We talk about things like water quality. People are concerned about safe drinking water whether you live in a town of 200 or 200,000. And I think that's the message we're trying to get out there.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to the other members of our committee, and Patty has one that she'd like to talk about water quality.
As you just mentioned, the water quality is an issue in our state. And the voluntary nutrient reduction strategy is not working. As governor, what will you do to strengthen our water quality policy and to strengthen and direct DNR to improve water quality?
Yeah, first of all, we have to base things on actual information, and right now we're seeing a trend of actually getting away from testing and other measurable things to know what the problems are, to know how they have to be addressed. The less we know about a problem, the harder it is to solve it. So I think what the first thing we have to do is re-engage the DNR in actually monitoring and measuring what's going on in our waterways in this state. One of the things that we've seen very little progress on is engaging in funding the Waterland Legacy Trust Fund, something that Iowans asked for by 60% of the vote. and there's been no action on that. And that's not a solving, all problems solution, but it's an important step in the process. And it's not just about even water quality in that, and that's getting back to quality habitat for, wildlife and land management practices. We've seen the shutdown of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. So we can't even be, again, informed of sustainable agricultural practices because we're eliminating the learning process in this. So I think those are critical steps. And then, engaging our rural communities in the discussion as well. I stood up on issues on water quality in the Iowa legislature this year. We did not see action improving water quality from the Republicans, Senate, House, or governor's office. We saw a bill come through that limited nuisance lawsuits. I resisted that, but we saw, not being able to hold your neighbors accountable for those practices. We saw a bill push through that limited local control again. When we talk about a real solution on this, having to ask your neighbors their input on where a hog lot is sited is going to affect what you're going to be able to install and how it's going to work. So, I think we have to get back to local control. I think we have to get back to responsibility, and then start doing the things to learn about the root cause of the problem and start addressing those as well. So those are things that I think need to be done immediately.
How would you fund strengthening DNR? Because right now, there aren't enough people to do the work.
Right.
So how do you see raising the funds to do that?
Yeah. So it's the same drum I've been beating for the last year, which is we have seen corporate tax credits and exemptions and giveaways go from $300 million in 2011 to now approaching $600 million today. And it's very clearly eating a hole in our budget to do those types of things. I mean, when we talk about the commercial property tax credit, leaving that uncapped and ripe for abuse by some of the most wealthy corporations in our state, that's a problem. When we saw the consumables tax credit, that was a rule change that was put through, costing our state not the $20 million per year that it was promised, but actually closer to $90 million a year, because these things aren't being thought out in a cohesive manner. If we had $300 million still in our budget, rather than the giveaways that were just enacted in the last 6 or 7 years, where would our budget be right now? We wouldn't have had to have rated emergency funds to over $100 million. We wouldn't be in a position to having to call a special session to fund what we have now. Instead, we would be talking about the $900 million surplus we had before and how to prioritize where that spending would go. So I don't think it's a huge mystery as to where the state's finances have gone wrong. It's just that there are people not willing to acknowledge the very direct cause and effect. And anybody who says, well, that takes 2 or 3 years to kick in to get those repeals done. Well, that was true 2 or 3 years ago, and we still haven't done anything, right? So we have to start acting on that. And that's when we can start budgeting the real priorities in the state. And that's what I think can be a winning message in this campaign. Investing in water quality and protecting our natural resources. Funding our education system so we have the skilled workforce for tomorrow. Investing in rural Iowa infrastructure improvements for economic growth for the long term, not giveaways to singular entities and hoping they create jobs as promised. It's a complete philosophical change that's needed.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm Vern Tigas. I'm originally from Carroll County and transplanted since I retired to Adel. And when I was in Carroll County, I was an electronics technician and did some farming on site. But I'm here today to talk about racial discrimination, white supremacy, for one, because it's been in the news the last couple of weeks. But it's always been there. It's always been there, and it is here in Iowa. I don't know if you can feel it as you go around. You get blowback on some of the issues that you might be putting out there. Well, I belong to a multiracial family, and we feel it. And But then again, racial inequality isn't the only thing where there's discrimination. There's also religious discrimination, there's sexual discrimination. Just to give an example of what's happened in the Senate the last few weeks. There's another thing there. What would you do to make sure that this no longer goes on in Iowa? I know you can't do any further than that, but in Iowa,
Yeah.
for one thing, what would you do to instill in the population that there's only one way to do this, and that's the right way?
Yeah, no, Iowa, it's so frustrating because Iowa has had such a proud history of advancing civil rights in this state and being ahead of the curve in so many ways. One of the things that I've done in private practice is I've stood up for people's civil rights. I've stood up to employers who were, called the N-word in very large companies that people to this day believe does not happen anymore, and it absolutely does. I've stood up for people who have been discriminated against based on their sexual orientation. I've done that as an attorney. I'm very in tune to exactly the level of problem that's out there. In terms of sexual harassment in the workplace, I've stood up for victims of sexual harassment in the workplace, and I am deeply troubled by what we have seen from the Senate Republicans in their, not only that this problem existed, their reaction to this in the past month is sickening. The only person to have suffered an employment consequence from that harassment that happened was the victim. She lost her job. No one else is going to share the burden of paying the verdict. That's going to be Iowa taxpayers to the tune of $2.2 million, likely plus attorney's fees on top of that. No one else has had a letter of reprimand in their file over this. And Bill Dix, immediately after the verdict was released, said, no, she was terminated due to poor job performance, despite a week-long trial where people who still work there testifying about the environment that they were in, and a jury verdict conclusively stating that that was not the reason. And you're just ignoring that as a basic fact. Seeing, in terms of racial disparity in our court system, I will say I am proud of the efforts Chief Justice Cady has undertaken to deal with implicit bias in our court system and start addressing it at an institutional level, acknowledging the problem exists and going out to district court judges, to county prosecutors, to say, why is Iowa in the shape that it is in terms of disparity in criminal prosecutions in this state. So the first step is acknowledging that the problem still exists, and I very much will tell anyone that the problem still exists in very, very plain ways across our communities, and then making sure that we have access to causes of action that allow people to recover from harm done to them and hold people accountable for discrimination at work and in other settings. And we've seen legislation pushed through that would have limited the filing period for particularly employment-related claims for retaliation. I mean, it's hard to stand up to your employer, the person who provides your paycheck, and to narrow the window means you're very unlikely to step forward in the amount of time that you have. If you keep narrowing down to whether it's 100 days or 180 days, the shorter the time period for you to stand up for your rights, the less likely you are going to get to the point where you are committed to filing that civil rights complaint. That is that first step to addressing the problem that very likely is not just your problem. It's happening to other people in that same setting, whether it's housing or in employment. We need people to stand up for themselves in this process, and we can make it easier for them to do that.
Okay, I think maybe I didn't phrase it just right.
Okay.
You gave me the solutions to after the problem was recognized. How would you preempt having sexual abuse and all those discriminations that are out there? How would you go about preempting this in the state of Iowa?
Well, I think education, doing the best we can to see where the problems are, which is why I mentioned what's going on with the court system, for example. Having a commitment to doing seminars, presentations, to recognize the implicit bias that is there, to start addressing it preemptively before it becomes, an issue further. So I think doing more of the education process in our communities and in state government to get us there.
Hey, my name's Tom Mohan. I'm a member from Cedar Rapids. So this endorsement process is a newer thing with us. I believe you might have been our first candidate we endorsed first time around here when you ran. And our vision is that we do politics differently, and so we view using elections to build organizations and movements and mandates for social, racial, economic, and environmental justice that can win. And so, in your campaign, how do you see yourself and your campaign doing that?
In doing a messaging on economic
Building
justice.
the movement, exactly, that can forward those movements.
Well, I think part of it has been using the platform of the state senate. We had thousands of people come to the Capitol on some of these critical issues, and making sure that their voices were heard and recognized, and being a part of building that movement and participation. And one of the most proud moments was seeing not only people come by the thousand for the collective bargaining fight or for Planned Parenthood, but seeing it happen over and over and over again. People didn't get outrage fatigue or discouraged because the votes just weren't there to resist the agenda. But the people were there at the forums across the state, at the Capitol, and building on that movement that we can do this, and engaging people as much as possible to keep that momentum building, and talk about those issues that are important. I mean, we are talking about very core Iowa values here. Taking care of each other, making sure that people have the right to be safe in their workplace and earn a wage that's worth their work. Making sure we have an education system that is, once again, a source of pride in our state. That's been something that's defined Iowa for generations. We've been a world leader in public education. We can't say that right now. And we can't say that for a very simple reason. We have underfunded our schools to the point where they're struggling to replace classroom materials and maintain course offerings. We saw something that was, to me, very unforgivable this last year in terms of education funding. We actually saw Regents institutions tempted to lobby against private colleges for funding. We've never seen that. We've never seen community colleges fighting Regents institutions or private colleges fighting K-12 for resources in education. We cannot let that happen. What's been great about Iowa's educational system is the whole thing has had the ability to succeed. So you could go to an apprenticeship right out of high school, or you could get into a medical program at the University of Iowa. But you could choose your course, and here in Iowa you had the path to do it. And so when we see those things deteriorating, making sure we're engaging people at the community level to say, here's where we make the difference. This is how you actually stand up for the education system. It's by speaking out, it's by coming to these forums, it's by participating in the process. Because if you don't, we're going to continue to see school funding decrease against inflation. We're going to continue to see rural communities deteriorate because there's been no active outreach improving infrastructure. I have no idea where the next generation of teachers comes from. If we tell teachers, you're never going to see a wage increase that beats inflation, you're going to have a higher and higher debt load from tuition increases. Iowa and Iowa State just proposed 7% per year for the next 5 years. And it's not because the president of the university just decides we want to be mean to students. It's because state funding hasn't been there to address the level of services they want to provide to their students. So how do we tell that person to go from their UNI education with a higher debt load, go into a rural school where they're not going to see wage increases that beat inflation, and they're going to have a lesser voice in their health insurance and other benefits. So when schools are underfunded, they're using their limited salary to pay for the materials they need to get by, and paying more and more of their health insurance because that's where schools are going to make up their budgets because they're not getting that supplemental state aid that they need. I mean, connecting all those dots and making sure people are seeing the very real impact in their community and how they can stand up for it. That's what we're trying to do.
You've talked a lot about how you would undo some of the changes or some of the harmful legislation that was enacted by reactionaries at our legislature this last session. kind of what I think Tom might be getting at, and this follows up with healthcare and some of the other questions we've asked, whether it be Medicare for all or some sort of universal healthcare in Iowa, or implementing day one a $15 minimum wage. How bold are you willing to be in supporting these movements for things? Another one might be free college tuition in this state. How bold are you willing to be if you have a Democratic majority that could accomplish those things?
So, I'm not a stranger to the political process. I was there when Democrats did have full control of the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, and I was frustrated by the things that were not being delivered. I was there. I wanted to see expanded scope public sector bargaining. That was very important to me. I went there. I think firefighters should be able to talk about their protective equipment when they go to a fire call. I think staffing is an important topic for firefighters when they go into a fire, knowing if there's going to be one or two of them going into the building. I mean, things like that. DHS workers that go into homes, making sure that they have adequate staffing levels and can maintain their files. I mean, just so many ways that we were disappointed in that environment. I wanted to see workers get a choice of doctor in this state when they're injured. The only time that you don't really have a voice in who your medical care provider is if you happen to be injured at work. And then you lose all sense of reality in terms of how to address your work-related illness or injury. I mean, that should be very just wrong to know that the employer is charting the course for your medical care when you're injured at work, as if the employer all of a sudden has all this knowledge about your rotator cuff tear that you don't. Things like that to me are very personal, and so I am talking about addressing those things with an affirmative agenda, and we're going to keep talking about it. We're going to keep part of our campaign will be rolling out plans as we move forward and talking about things that we want to see done in this state. So I think we do have to coalesce behind some improvements to the quality of life in this state, and not just gaining back what was lost.
Thanks. We're running a little short on time, but we have a couple more.
Hi, my name is Caleb. I was a student at Ames at Iowa State, but I have to take time off because of the devastating funding cuts that cut tuition aid and stuff. So my question is about higher ed. You said in your questionnaire response that you want to make higher education debt-free, but your response was super vague, and you didn't give any specifics at all on how you would tackle the problem of student debt. And you really didn't answer the overall question. So I'll ask you it again. Will you fight to make 4-year colleges tuition-free? Why or why not?
So tuition-free, I think, is not as important as debt-free as an option. I think when we have families that are perfectly capable of affording a 4-year education, that the state shouldn't have to subsidize that. I mean, I think that's something that when we talk about 2-year institutions, 4-year institutions, our community colleges, and our Regents institutions, I think we do have to make sure that we have debt-free paths based on economic need that are real paths to a 2-year or 4-year degree in this state. But at the same time, I think you can create a whole lot of problems with just free tuition across the board at community colleges and Regents institutions that would have to be addressed with how those programs are qualified and what, I just think that can create a whole host of secondary problems that instead having that commitment to making sure that debt-free is an option can be a much more viable alternative.
You still don't give me any information at all on how you would make it debt-free.
Well, I think need-based grants and programming. I think that's the first of many steps.
We already have grants and programming.
Not adequate enough to get to the 7% tuition increases that will be coming for the next 5 years. Funding our educational institutions appropriately is a priority again, so we're not using tuition dollars to supplant state money that has been lost.
Okay, so just to clarify, you're not with us and you're not with the progressive base of the Democratic
If you want to put it that way, that's your decision.
Okay.
That's your decision. If you want to simplify it that way, you certainly can. But I don't think the solution to education and higher education is tuition-free. I think with debt-free is the difference.
Okay.
All right, and I think we have one more, Susan.
Knowing what we know now about how disastrous the Dakota access is for Iowans, after all, that we have 11 jobs only to Iowans, and oil will certainly be obsolete in the near future, possibly 13 years. If you had it to do over again, would you still support it? And if you would, Dave, why?
Tell me what I did to support it. I mean, that's been something that has surprised me over and over again.
Oh, please
I don't know
tell
what
me.
action I have taken
Okay.
that had anything to do with that.
Did you file any objections with the IUB along with us and other groups?
I didn't take
Protest
that
it?
step. I didn't
So
take that step.
I guess we would say you certainly were not a vocal opponent.
If you want to say that, that's fine.
That's actually correct.
But I think there's a big difference between saying that I did anything affirmatively on that.
Okay, so for eminent domain, what's your stand on that?
I think eminent domain across the board needs to be reformed, whether it's for utilities or for other projects. I think we have to get serious about what can and cannot be used in eminent domain. I have a commitment to input more resources into things like I co-sponsored a bill that would have increased the solar tax credit and made Iowa much more advantageous in terms of renewable energy resources. We already have a third of our energy coming from renewable resources, and I think as we look at the future, that's something that our economy can be outstanding on and can actually create jobs for the long term. Wind energy, solar energy. We have the technology here. We have companies here that are doing it the right way. We can make investments in it that pay off and pay dividends and get that technology spread to more individual homes, and again, reducing our commitment, or excuse me, our dependence on fossil fuels. When it comes to my support in labor, laborers make funds whether they are building a pipeline or they're building a wind turbine, and investing in renewable energy is just as productive. So I think that's an important thing that we do, is invest in renewable energies and technologies so we can further get away from the fossil fuels. And I think Iowa can get to the point where we have 50% of our energy produced in this state by renewable resources by 2025. And I think we have to press ourselves to get there. And once we get to 50%, then we can start getting towards the 100% that we should have for the long-term future of our state, as well as addressing the problem of climate change.
With eminent domain, is it not true now that it should not be used by a private company for their profit? Is that not how it is already?
So then that's why I say I think we need to tighten that down, because it's a public benefit system.
Yes.
And we need to clarify the language of what is really a public benefit in our communities. The courts have determined that it's a pretty broad meaning. And we want to be able to make sure that state government can, or local governments can address critical needs in their communities with eminent domain, but not be able to abuse the process, again, for short-term private gains.
Thank you.
Oh, well, very good. So one last question. In one sentence, why do you want our endorsement?
Well, you guys have done a great job standing up for the issues that I've cared about in this last legislative session. Your endorsement meant a lot to me when I ran for the Iowa Senate, and seeing this agenda go through was a tough thing to do, but the fact that you guys were there and we had a good partnership there of pushing back, of calling attention to what was happening and who was doing it to people, I think is a great thing. And whatever I can do to be helpful to you guys, don't hesitate to reach out. Even if you endorse another candidate, I hope that doesn't end our discussions and our involvement with each other, because we've got a very tough legislative session ahead. And I don't think there's any slowdown coming because it's an election year. If they're talking about reforming, quote unquote, IPERS, that means they're willing to take on a whole host of topics this coming session without regard to the fact that it's an election year. Right. So stay involved, stay engaged, and keep me included as I will try to reach out to you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the time today.